We're here launching this new venture this week, Brussels Signal. How do we fit into, there are already various publications reporting on Brussels and the EU and the publication. How do we, Brussels Signal as a new startup, fit into the existing media landscape in Europe's capital?
Right, well, as you say, there are already a few publications. I think you could say that there are maybe 2 or 3 which are doing a fairly good job. So 1 or 2 of them are well staffed, and there are some of them breaking stories. But at the same time, I think it's fair to say that they're fairly close to the EU institutions. One of the reasons why they're getting some of these stories is that they are close to people like von der Leyen, the European Commission President, and therefore there are a lot of people, both in Brussels and in the national capitals, who don't necessarily have a voice. And I think that's where we can fit in. We can give these people a voice by challenging the EU narrative. That's the goal, I think, the goal of the news desk here.
Last year was Russia's invasion of Ukraine, a bit over a year ago. I mean, that's transformed everything. You've got a potential continent-wide war for the first time in Europe for 80 years. You have the EU is not a belligerent, but it's becoming more and more involved with the arming of Ukraine. And what's sort of happened, there's long been a debate, should the EU have a military role? It hasn't had one, but it's now adopting with a quasi-military role by default, without debate, without examination.
Right, that's a good subject for debate. In fact, why don't we have it in the Brussels Signal studio? This looks very professional.
Yep. The logic of these large institutions, such as the EU, might be logic of all bureaucracies, is to increase regulation. If you have a large bureaucratic structure whose purpose is to regulate, it'll inevitably increase regulation. And the Brussels media isn't challenging that as much as it might do. So that could be a role for that'll be a role for the Brussels Signal, questioning whether this regulation is needed.
Right, and I think that feeds into what we were saying, doesn't it, about freedom of expression and free speech. I mean, is this an area that needs regulating? Obviously, if you start to regulate, then you're going to be defining the limits of free speech. That's a sine qua non, isn't it?
Yeah.
Regulation might actually automatically mean censorship. And I think no one is asking that question.
The problem is with these regulations is they're always there to solve a problem. i.e. the problem is disinformation, the problem is children looking at websites they shouldn't be looking at, the problem is nasty sites pushing people in strange directions, false opinions. But the answer they then always come up with is more regulation. And what we need to interrogate is, in fact, might that regulation not create worse problems than the problems they're trying to solve? Right. Obviously, regulation feeds into more and more markets and more regions. With the rise of big tech, etc. Initially, this was quite difficult to regulate, but now the regulators are thinking, what should we do? What actions should the EU take on these matters? And the more those debates need to be debated, and the costs of those regulations need to be examined, which just isn't happening enough, is it?
Well, I guess the first big test is going to be Twitter, isn't it? I mean, what's going to happen? We're in a situation today, or we're at the beginning of June, and if you look at the toing and froing between Musk and the European Commission, it would seem like they're headed for some kind of clash. How important is the European Union market to Twitter? That's one question. But will the regulation actually lead to some companies pulling out? That's one consequence. So this is a very, very delicate subject. I mean, I think that you and me would naturally be on the side of as much free speech as possible. Are we free speech extremists? I don't know. Where would you put yourself in this debate?
The problem is, obviously there is reprehensible speech out there, but I would argue the best way of combating obnoxious views is not by banning them, is not by saying we can't go there, but by interrogating those points of view, by questioning, by debating. And I mean, that and that's a voice which is vital and missing, and which needs to be heard. Don't sort of say it just gives views oxygen by saying they're too appalling, they need to be shut out. So those issues need to be debated, and that's both, and that's partly what the Brussels signal will do. It'll debate stuff which isn't widely debated at the moment. Look at issues in the round, but the risk here at the moment is this excess EU regulation of social media.
And I wonder, I mean, it's an open question. It will be great to get some feedback from our readers in continental Europe on this issue. To what extent is free speech really important in continental Europe? I mean, we're coming from a UK background, but I think it's important to recognise that these kind of issues are treated differently in the different EU member states. I mean, there is a tradition in France, for example, for the state to be closely associated with television, at least. I mean, as we were discussing earlier, it was Pompidou who said, television is la voix de la France, is the voice of France, and therefore it was justified for the French state to control television. So maybe some member states will be coming at this from a different angle. And personally, what I would like to get is some feedback from our readers as to what they think about free speech. I mean, and that's something which we can do both over the web page and also in events here in the studio.
Which we're hoping to hold here, precisely.
Yeah.
The big change that's happened over the last year in the EU, last February, Russia's aggression against Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And it's the first potential continent-wide war for 80 years in Europe. And that's totally, with these crises, just as with the COVID crisis, it's led to transformations of EU powers. Previously, the EU there's been always talk of a military dimension, but it hasn't gone there.
Yeah.
Now, even though the treaties don't allow it, it's at the forefront of arming Ukraine.
Right, and in fact that's something which we've already got up on the website, a news stories and analysis of what's gone on and how the European Commission in particular has got around this ban on funding wars by creating a complex structure, which means that the EU is funding the Ukraine militarily while not funding Ukraine in legal terms. And these kind of tricks that the European Commission has engaged in, I think are the kind of thing we can highlight without necessarily taking a moral view on the rights and wrongs.
What the view there is, it needs to be debated. I mean, someone like me who's very hawkish on Ukraine and Russia and would support strong Western support for Ukraine and strong sanctions against Russia. These issues still need to be debated. It seems wrong to me that they are introduced without public discussion. You don't get genuine support for the policies if they're sort of pushed through in a sort of very bleak way. And I think that's what's happening at the moment. There isn't enough public debate and public discussion. This is why we should stand up for Ukraine. This is why we're arming it. There's too much sort of, as you say, using strange mechanisms and workarounds to get there. And it's a slightly bizarre situation. Decisions which could have an impact for the next 40, 50 years are being taken without wide public debate.
Yes, and I think as well, they say follow the money, don't they? And I think that the money is a key issue here. We're talking about billions and billions of euros, yeah? To what extent is this money actually controlled? Do we know where it's going? And it's always been an issue in the European Union. Obviously, the agricultural funds, again, very large budgets. Is there enough, the structural funds, is there enough control of what is taxpayer money? And do we know where it's going? How much corruption is there? These are all questions which I think are perfectly fair to ask.
And what used to be the case before Brexit is you had this quite aggressive UK press corps based in Brussels. Most famous member of it, of course, is Boris Johnson, who his career sort of went off here and ended up at number 10. But understandably, post-Brexit, most of that withdrew. Most of that, there was much less interest in Britain in Brussels. And part of our project is asking those questions which are no longer being asked.
That's very true. I think the mainstream media in general, obviously, in decline, less profits to be made, and therefore, in the UK for sure, but not only in the UK, there is less coverage now than there was before, and therefore less questioning of the EU institutions. I think that's the logical consequence.
The other interesting thing which is happening politically in Europe is actually more in Europe than in Britain, is that the traditional parties in most countries are declining. The traditional parties of the centre-left and the centre-right. You look at France, I mean, the centre-left, the old Socialist Party, long history, all but totally collapsed. On the right, it isn't as extreme, and the parties change more, but the Republicans are now much weaker than they were. And you have Mélenchon, and then you have the Front National, or whatever it's now called, riding on the right. And throughout Europe, you have these challenges to mainstream parties. A poll out just now, early June, it shows that the second party in Germany in polling now is the AfD. From nothing emerged populist challenges on the right. The Social Democrats who lead the current government in Germany are on 17%. So the whole political makeup of Europe is being shaken up dramatically. And we've got the European elections coming, and so it's an exciting time to be reporting on these areas now, because something's happening. We don't know where it'll end. We don't know if the old parties will re-establish themselves. But there's big challenges to party structure, a post-war party structure, emerged different times in different countries, but it all seems to be breaking down. And this is the time to report on it, to see what replaces it.
Right, yeah, exciting times. And I think, would it be fair to say that the new forces that are appearing, they're more likely to be anti-Brussels than pro-Brussels? I think that's fair.
That's very much true, I think.
On the left and the right.
On the left and the right, yeah. Mélenchon, something of a Eurosceptic.
Right. So why? The question is why. I think it's a fact that the EU, support for the EU is in decline, even if obviously no one is talking about leaving the EU yet. But nevertheless, criticism is on the rise, support on the decline, and so...
And active support for the project, active support for ever closer union, is very weak in most countries.
Very weak. And why? I mean, that's the question, isn't it? Why?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because these institutions which see themselves as sort of quasi replicas of national institutions, they haven't had that resonance. They haven't had that debate. I mean, there isn't. The European Parliament isn't treated by anyone as the equivalent to national parliament, is it? By the media.
Well, I think as far as the Europe, that's an interesting question, because I think Qatargate showed that the European Parliament is very important for countries like Morocco and Qatar, because they want to influence what's happening in the European Parliament. But so it may be the European Parliament is more important for countries outside the European Union than it is for the countries within the European Union. But it's nevertheless
But if
true.
you look at national news anywhere, you see all the reporting. There's a key vote in their national parliament.
Yeah.
They never leave the news on.
No.
There's an exciting breaking news from the European Parliament.
No, the European Parliament has never discussed, doesn't have the power to discuss key issues affecting Europeans. I mean, let's face it, the European Parliament can't declare war, can it?
No, exactly.
And there's a whole host of other issues where it can express its opinion, which is then almost always ignored.
In the Brussels Signal, we'll also be reporting on what the European Parliament is doing into a wider Europe-wide audience, and seeing, because these decisions do matter to the citizens of the EU. They are decisions which affect their lives. They're just underreported in the national media.
Right, and then we're also talking about the rise in. We're trying to avoid the word Euroscepticism, aren't we? Because it's too associated with Brexit, and we don't want to be Brexit focused. But nevertheless, it's a rise in
critical thought about the
criticism,
further EU integration.
Yes.
And that's both seen on the left and the right. So you'd have in, as we said, Mélenchon in France, in Italy, the Five Star Movement, which is, however you see it, left or right, not clear, but it's clearly not seen as a traditional conservative force, if anything, seen as a left-wing force. And that was Eurosceptic.
And then, of course, that means that there's a power struggle when these parties come into power. Let's look at what's happening in Italy with Meloni. I mean, traditionally Eurosceptic, but obviously has to live within the EU structures
Within the
as
EU
they
framework,
exist
yeah.
today. It's a very uncomfortable relationship. And is that sustainable? I mean, and then the same thing is happening in Poland. And we've seen the European Commission clamp down with it using its main tool, which is money.
Yeah.
There is a fight going on now between Brussels and these more anti-European governments, and this could.
And there's too often in some of the Brussels media been the idea that the European Union and its institutions are the good guys.
Right.
And anyone who challenges
That's
them
true.
are nasty.
That's true.
There's a lot of work for the Brussels signal to do. I mean, there is a role there, gaping hole in the Brussels media landscape. We're going to both send the news from Brussels out throughout Europe, also going to bring news stories in other parts of Europe which are underreported here to a Brussels audience. And all these sort of issues aren't interrogated enough. So that's why there's a hole in the media landscape, which I think we can do our best in filling.
Right, that's our goal. And I think maybe for the people watching this, we should underline the fact that whereas we're both British, we don't have an all-British team here. We have obviously like-minded journalists, but we already have a journalist from Belgium, from Italy, from Ireland. So this is not a UK-centric project at all. It's already, even here in Brussels, Europe-wide.
Europe, that's the idea, how Europe-wide reporting from Europe, different parts of Europe, bringing the news to Brussels, also reporting what's happening in Brussels, which is vitally important to the citizens of Europe, to a wider audience.